Genetics is showing us an epic history we would have otherwise known nothing about. For matching with archaeology, we've found absolutely epic events occurred behind the veil of history from before we have records. Massive wars and migrations took place and leaders rose and fell in the dark of prehistory. This video will look at the genetic records of the fluctuating map of prehistory to see some of these great events, to see the stories that have never been told. Our ancestors were skilled craftsmen who were able to benefit their tribes and pass down their legacy through the ages. You can learn skills that will provide a richer life for you and those around you with our sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with classes covering a wide range of topics from graphic design to photography and marketing. There's a class by Marcus Brownlee on the basics of running a YouTube channel, which is great for anyone interested in getting into this field. Skillshare is for creative and curious people who want to spend time investing in something that can enrich their lives and provide opportunities in the future. It provides classes that include a combination of video lessons and a class project that can fit your schedule and skill level. Skillshare is designed to help you learn, there are no ads, and they're always launching new premium classes so you can explore something new and focus on building skills that will last a lifetime. No matter who you are, you can benefit by visiting Skillshare and finding something that interests you. The first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so start exploring your creativity today. Before we start, I want to deal with something. I'm going to talk about race and races in this video, and some people think that race is a social construct and doesn't exist in the real world. This is patently false from all the evidence we have. From genetics, we can figure out where your ancestors are from and see clusters of different races that are genetically distinct from each other. Our culturally defined boundaries of race don't line up perfectly with genetics, and that Middle Easterners and Europeans are genetically the same group, and Africa is divided into countless very genetically distinct groups, but they line up better if these categories didn't exist at all in the real world. People like to say race is a social construct since we've constructed various cultural ideas about what being part of each race means, but that makes no sense since we construct social ideas about everything in the world, and that doesn't make them unreal. We have social constructs about the sun, horses, dogs, and men and women, but that doesn't mean those things don't exist in the real world. Similarly, we can see across history that genetic differences between different races can be meaningful. For example, look at the advantages that some groups have by their ability to digest milk that other cultures don't. Alternatively, how Africans were imported to the tropical New World since they had immunity to diseases that Europeans didn't. Africans could work all day in the fields while majorities of new European arrivals would die within their first year in the tropics. Alternatively, there's a gene for risk-taking behavior and extroversion that alternates between 0% of the population in places like China or Japan to 80% among the native tribes of the Amazon. Something to make extremely clear is that we have no evidence of meaningful genetic differences on a race-by-race basis for intelligence. For reasons I explain in this text wall, I don't buy the race and IQ arguments in which the cultural differences seem to be dominant. Also, there's no value judgment between different races, in which no one says that one race is superior than the other just because there are differences. Modern humans evolved something like 350,000 years ago in East Africa. The first group to split off and the most similar people in the world, both genetically and culturally, to the first humans are the San of South Africa and Namibia, who live in the desert with a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Humans left Africa 100,000 or so years ago, and something to make clear is the vast majority of humans stayed in Africa, with a small branch of people a couple thousand strong populating the rest of the world. Africa has significantly more genetic diversity than the rest of the world combined, with, in a genetic map, the rest of the world basically being tacked on to Africa's genetic diversity. Around 70,000 years ago, there was a massive supervolcano eruption in Indonesia called Toba, which plunged the world into a nasty ice age. The effects of this were to lower the human population around the whole world to around 7,000 people, or roughly that of a cruise liner. Humans survived around the coast by eating shellfish. The population crunch was much greater outside Africa than in it, with disproportionate effects in the people that would become the ancestors of non-Africans. Humans actually have pretty low genetic diversity for a mammal species. I mean, compare us to dogs, which always made racism seem foolish to me. A theory I thought up independently, and I'm very happy the scientific community verified, was that this is connected to the cognitive revolution. The cognitive revolution was around 60,000 years ago when we start to see humans wear clothes, have art, religion, regional culture differentiation, and technological progress. It seems like humans made the jump to thinking about abstract ideas in the future, rather than just the immediate material world around them. What probably happened was that the humans that couldn't think abstractly didn't survive, while the crisis created a selection pressure for the smarter ones that could. Humans came out of this crisis being able to organize large groups around abstract ideas like the nation or religion. Humans bred with other types of humans like the Neanderthals quite a bit, fluctuating depending on region. Although the Neanderthals lived in Europe, the most Neanderthal humans are East Asians who bred with Neanderthals on their way east, while the ancestors of the Europeans were still around Egypt, and as we'll see, the modern inhabitants of Europe share practically no ancestry with its inhabitants during the last ice age. New Guineans and Australians are at 90% Homo sapiens, with 5% coming from both Neanderthals and red deer caveman, a human species from Siberia, which the only genetic evidence of which is a broken jaw. Interestingly enough, West Africans have 20% admixture from some other species of human that we have no idea about. Something I'd like to make clear is that I'm not making value judgments based on how Homo sapiens someone is, and the effects on intelligence seem minor. Black and white Americans, for example, raised under similar circumstances full of similar IQs. The thing that suggested the other species of humans we wiped out and bred with must have had pretty high average intelligences. The genetic and racial map of the world during the Ice Age was completely different from the world today. We'll go through the whole world over this video, but a great example I'd like to use is the Americas. Most of us know that the ancestors of the Native Americans came from Siberia, and most of us think they came over the land bridge now submerged in Siberia and Alaska. However, the genetics of Native Americans have been leaving us really startled with how bizarre, for lack of a better term, they are. Let me tell you about it. A major problem with the land bridge theory is that we've found evidence of human occupation in the Americas before it was physically possible to walk to America, meaning people must have sailed. This lines up with a significant amount of Polynesian DNA found among Native Americans. This was since the ancestors of the Polynesians originally came from coastal China and seem to have sailed around the Pacific Rim to America, leaving genetic markers along the coast of Pacific Americans. The next major groups that came to the New World were those that walked across the land bridge, or the ancestors of the Mongols and the Ainu. The Ainu are the indigenous, nearly extinct inhabitants of Japan that once lived across most of East Asia. They look European, but that's not because they're genetically similar to the Europeans. The Ainu are a separate race in of themselves, but more an original branch of the people who left Africa had European-like facial structures, and it's coincidence. These two groups are the biggest ancestral groups for Native Americans. A strange and confusing factor is the Native Americans have European ancestry going back thousands of years to the last ice age, with some groups having up to 80% ancient European ancestry. This is since there was a population called the ancient North Eurasians in Siberia during the last ice age that are the ancestors of both the Native Americans and Europeans. One group went east while the other went west. All of these different racial groups are why we see so many bizarre and out-of-place skulls in prehistoric America. For example, we have the Kennewick Man, or European-looking skull found in Oregon, or the Australian Aboriginal-looking skull in the Amazon. This would make sense given that during the last ice age, people like the Australian Aboriginals were the native inhabitants of India and Southeast Asia, so it's not surprising that some did end up in the Americas. What happened with the Native Americans was that over time all of these racial groups combined into the modern Native Americans. An interesting side note is that modern Siberians don't have a lot of genetic impact on modern Native Americans. By the time the modern Siberians got to Siberia, the Americas were already taken, but they did settle in the American Arctic as the Inuit around 2000 BC, while also introducing the bow and arrow to the continent. A branch did end up going south, becoming the Apache and the Navajo. The invention of agriculture increased humans' numbers remarkably and precipitated possibly the largest demographic shifts in history. Hunter-gatherers only pretty rarely adopt farming of their own volition, and by far the most common result was that the incoming farmers genocided the native hunter-gatherer populations. Let's look at what happened in the Middle East. During the last ice age, this region had three distinct races, each as different from each other as East Asians are from Europeans today. One was based around modern Iran, another Turkey and Syria, and another in Egypt. With agriculture, these groups mixed together and created the group that, for lack of a better term, is white people. With the invention of agriculture, this group spread around the world. One branch went north into Russia, another into India, mixing with the local Australian Aboriginal hunter-gatherer population, and another into Europe, where they genocided the local population. Europe had seen several waves of genocide and repopulation since its earlier settlement, with this just being one example. This was not a clean process and took thousands of years. An example of which is that the hunter-gatherer fishermen from the Baltic were quite prosperous and wealthy and launched a powerful offensive against the farmer communities of Central Europe, knocking them back for several generations. We see similar patterns in East Asia with two different races developing in China, one being the people who grew millet along the Yellow River and the others being the rice cultivators along the Yangtze. These groups mixed to broadly form Asians and then spread around the region, driving the Ainu into northern Japan and the Australian Aboriginals from Southeast Asia. The ancestors of the Polynesians spread across island Southeast Asia, eventually driving towards the Pacific and Madagascar. However, even today there are populations of hunter-gatherer peoples like the Australians' Aboriginals called Negritos that survive in Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines in the jungle. These tiny islands between India and Burma are called the Andamans, and even today, they have a population of Stone Age hunter-gatherers similar to the Ainu, Australian Aboriginal inhabitants of Ice Age Southeast Asia. Africa got agriculture later, with the Bantus in modern Nigeria only being able to hit critical mass population density around 500 BC, when they developed genetic immunity to malaria as well as iron tools which let them clear the jungle. This precipitated a massive migration across the continent, ending with around the fall of the Roman Empire and reaching South Africa. They displaced the previous population of pygmies or 4-foot-tall people who were the inhabitants of the jungle and reducing the survivors to subsidiaries and driving the San Bushmen who were the original inhabitants of the grasslands of southern and eastern Africa into the desert. This migration was finished and pushed to the southernmost point in Africa by the Khoikhoi, or the indigenous inhabitants of Botswana who became herders. For whatever reason, this process of the farmers genociding the native population didn't occur for the Americas, which is why the New World had 3 times the linguistic diversity as the Old at the time of Columbus. While agriculture precipitated the massive spread of farming peoples around the world, the rise of herding had a similar process. The ability to digest milk started around the Bosphorus, afterwards rapidly spread across the Old World with herding peoples. One of the first examples of this is the spread of Afro-Asiatic peoples from the Middle East. Herding peoples from Arabia spread across North Africa, wiping out the native population, becoming the Berbers in the Maghreb, and the ancestors of the Egyptians. Another group crossed into Ethiopia and Somalia, mixing with the local population. Something to consider was that the Sahara was a wet grassland, like that in North America or Central Asia today, and was a melting ground and vortex of different peoples. The herding techniques from the Middle East spread to Chad and South Sudan, where a couple very different genetic groups took them up and spread around East Africa. An example of this is the Maasai, the tallest people in the world who lived in Kenya and Tanzania, or the Nuer horsemen of the Sudan. However, the biggest migration was that of Indo-Aryan peoples starting in southern Russia. These people were a mix of farmers from the Middle East and ancient North Eurasians. With the invention of the chariot around 3000 BC, which conveyed massive technological advantages upon them, they started to spread across the world. One branch went west into Europe, wiping out the indigenous farmer inhabitants of northern Europe. In southern Europe, meanwhile, the native population remained a majority Middle Eastern farmer ancestry. The island of Sardinia off the coast of Italy remains genetically pretty identical to the original inhabitants of Europe. In places like the British Isles, there was a 90% removal of the ancient population. That means that a modern Italian is far more genetically similar to the builders of Stonehenge than me, a person of British and Irish descent. In Europe, we see a gradient between more Indo-Aryan ancestry in the north and more farmer in the south. However, across all of Europe, Indo-Aryan culture became largely dominant, even if genetics didn't. In places like Turkey and Iran, the process was pretty similar to southern Europe, where the Indo-Aryans became a significant minority of ancestry while displacing the native culture. In India, things get more complicated. First of all, from the evidence we have, we think the Indus Valley civilization was a conquest empire by Middle Easterners, with their artwork showing the ruling class looking Middle Eastern and the lower classes looking dark and South Indian. In India, we see a gradient like Europe's, in which the north has more Indo-Aryan ancestry and the south more native. However, we also saw the development of the caste system, where in much of India, the Indo-Europeans installed themselves as the dominant castes, with the native population as the lower ones. The caste system in which different social classes are forbidden from breeding has produced an incredible amount of genetic diversity inside India. An example of that is that it's not uncommon for different castes in the same village to have 3 times the genetic difference between them as Norwegians and Italians. The Indo-Aryans also went east into Central Asia and western China. The native inhabitants of Central Asia were European-like peoples until the time of the Roman Empire, roughly. An example of which is the mummies we found in western China who had red hair and wore tartan from 4,000 years ago. They're European-looking people in the terracotta army since the Chinese used these people as mercenaries. The shift that took place was that the Asian Turkic peoples migrated west around 600 AD, killing large parts of the native population and changing the population structure of Central Asia. We all know Genghis Khan got around a lot. He has 16 million direct male descendants today, or 0.5% of all men. However, what if I was to tell you there were at least 9 other figures across Asian history with genetic impacts as great as Genghis Khan, and we've only heard of one other, the Manchu conqueror Jiokonga. Most of the rest were in the Bronze Age. It seems like the places in history where single individuals can have the largest genetic impact is when nomadic herder warlords who have pretty loose attitudes about sex conquer giant farming societies. When you get back to prehistory, imbalances in the amount of sex people had can become enormous. An example is that in most hunter-gatherer societies, the chieftain has like half the women, and 20 to 40% of the male population dies in war. Polygamy in war is a recurring feedback loop in which, if more men don't have wives, since the chieftain has more wives, more men die in wars in order to prove themselves and get women from other tribes, which means there's a bigger gender disbalance, which means the chieftain has more of the surviving women. Polygamy and a massive death rate in war is why you have twice as many female ancestors as male across your lineage. We can trace a couple real historic figures with large genetic influences. Ireland and Scotland are some of the last herding societies in Western Europe are a great example of this, in which we have genetically found people with the same last name tend to have the same ancestor. People with the last name O'Neill share the 4th century pirate ancestor, Niall of the Nine Hostages, and it seems likely that people with the last name O'Connor are descendant from the Irish Hercules who probably lived around the birth of Christ Cuchulainn. Another example of this is that the Arab and Jewish descendants of Abraham, the supposed founder of Judaism, share a genetic lineage going back to that place and that era where Abraham was supposed to have lived. Similarly, the Cohens, or the Jewish priest class, which claim a common ancestor from Aaron, Moses' brother, do share the same Y chromosome an uncanny amount of times. It'll be really interesting going forward to see in what other ways genetics will change the way we view the past, and what other mythological figures will bring to life as legitimate. Until then, this is all I have, and I bid you all adieu. Well, what a feltist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Or alternatively, check out my Instagram, Twitter, or my Patreon, where I've got the first couple hundred pages of my history of the world and cultural